Good morning, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us this morning for this coffee chat with Sheriff Bill Benedict, the Colleen County Sheriff. And Bill's going to be covering a topic that's been in the news quite a bit lately, understandably so. There were many laws passed, I think a dozen in total in this legislative session, which address policing and police reform. So we're really pleased to have Sheriff Bill Benedict on with us to talk to us about the ramifications of those legal statute changes and how there may be unintended consequences. We also have Representative Mike Chapman on with us. He's dual tasking right now, though, is in a meeting also on the east side of the state over Zoom on drought. And so he did want to weigh in a bit when he can, more likely towards the end. So if everybody will put yourself on mute, except for Bill, I would very much appreciate it. And if you have any questions, please raise your virtual hand or put your question in the chat and I'll call on you to ask your question. So with that, Sheriff Bill, thanks so much for joining us and sharing some about what's happening today in the area of policing.
Well, thank you, Colleen, and good morning to everybody. Let me do a mic check. If anybody can't hear me adequately, raise your hand or whatever. So I'm going to assume that's all good. I'm looking at all the attendees, and I'm thinking to myself, this is mostly a group that I used to interact with at chamber lunches and other pre-pandemic stuff that has been put on hold. I hope that we get back to it. So let me start out by talking about kind of the scope. And there were two really good articles in today's Peninsula Daily News that if you read them, it'd give you good preparation for what I'm going to talk about. What I'm going to talk about is the legislation that went into effect midnight on July 25th. And that is the policies or changes to the law on essentially tactics, use of force, and primarily those two. So to put everything in perspective, and I'm going to repeat what Representative Chapman and I discussed earlier, is that this was a weird legislative session, and it was primarily run by Zoom. And the net result, as you look at it, is a lot of legislation. And unfortunately, a lot of it is contradictory. It's somewhat undefined, and the results of it are going to be some rather radical changing in policing that most law enforcement professionals and CEOs, myself included, are very concerned about. So we're going to divide it up essentially into, I'm going to start with changes for use of force. And as everyone knows, that law enforcement is generally entrusted with the ability to go hands-on with someone to effect an arrest. They're also given the tools and the training that they can respond to, let's say, deadly force with deadly force. In other words, it's probably the only branch of our society where law enforcement officers are entitled to use force up to including deadly force to either protect themselves or the public. So I'll start by saying that use of force as presently defined by our legislature, and let me start by saying that they really haven't defined it, but the conclusion that law enforcement and our attorneys have taken from it is use of force runs the spectrum right now from as much as touching someone on the shoulder, that's considered use of force, all the way up to deadly force. So the big change is they have said that use of force cannot be used on anyone unless that police officer has probable cause that they have committed a crime. And you can further read into it that they have committed a crime that could or should result in their arrest, detention, and even being jailed. Well, the effects of this are profound. The first thing is that law enforcement, and there's case law that supports it, everything from dealing with runaway children. If a runaway child does not want to be apprehended, if you will, we allow law enforcement to essentially grab them. It's harmless. We will physically grab them and restrain them, much like what a parent would be expected to do. So there's going to be problems. There's this expectation that, for example, that when your child runs away and you know where he's at, or her, where they're at, that law enforcement will be able to go and get them and bring them back, even against their will. Now, we're talking about potentially 10, 11-year-old children that could be in great danger, who we are now going to have to walk away from. I expect that will be addressed. But then the use of force goes even further than that. By federal law, we have what's known as a Terry stop. A Terry stop is where a crime has been committed and a law enforcement officer has reasonable suspicion. Now that's a bar slightly lower than probable cause. He or she knows a crime has been committed, and there are people there that are probably associated with that crime, either perpetrators or witnesses. In the past, we've had the ability to use the Terry stop, which is to detain someone forcibly if necessary, handcuff them, and at least question them about their involvement. Now, anyone that we do this to is obviously has their rights. They can refuse to talk to us, but they can't refuse to leave. With this legislation has now said that they are free to leave, and we are not able to detain them unless we have probable cause, which, trust me, coming up to a crime scene, you don't have probable cause for anything. You have to, you haven't interviewed victims, you haven't established the crime scene. Anyway, there's a fear that particularly for very violent crimes, I'll give you an example. Let's say that it's a bank robbery, and it's in the city, and the police roll up and they see someone running out of the bank, and they say, "Hey, you, stop, I want to talk to you." And the response is, "Screw you, I'm out of here." They jump in their car and drive off. Right now, and included with the pursuit policy changes, the best law enforcement can do is wave at them and say bye-bye. Use of force, probably the biggest thing now, the examples I'm giving you are somewhat rare, particularly with the bank robbery. We don't have that many, but we do have many crimes, particularly crimes of assault and property crimes, where when we arrive, that there are folks there that could help us solve it. We've lost this tool. And the next thing on use of force is in the area of mental health. And this is probably the thing that should concern the community the most. There's a bit of dissension. Some of the bill drafters have said that we're not following the intent of the law. We're following the letter of the law. Well, we've been reminded by attorneys that words have meaning. And when the legislature passes a law that has specific words about you will or you will not do something, we have to follow that. And what their intent is at this point is irrelevant. Anyway, on the mental health side, it's an unfortunate but fact of life. The way our state is, the way we fund it, is that mental health is not adequately funded, particularly for those in the lower socioeconomic rungs, including the homeless. And we have many people that are on our streets that have severe mental health problems that are compounded by alcohol and drug issues. And they will very often act out. And when they do, and let me add though, is that this also happens in Middle America, elsewhere. when someone is in a mental health crisis, your intuition will tell you they are not going to respond to much of anything, particularly if they are in severe crisis and they're wanting to harm themselves or someone else. Well, the physical force part means that it is not a crime to be in a mental health crisis. So therefore, when someone is in crisis, the only tools we have with the ITA, Involuntary Treatment Act law, is whether they're a danger to themselves or others. And the bill has further defined that is that it must be an imminent danger. And by imminent, we can say it has to be approximate danger. It has to be right there, right now, within a few minutes. If someone is saying some vague thing like, tomorrow I think I'm going to kill myself, or tomorrow I think I'm going to kill someone else, that is not considered imminent. The net result of that is that we are expected, pardon me while the phone rings. There we go. We're expected to assist mental health professionals in taking into custody, if you will, or at least bringing to it a place like a hospital where someone can be treated if they are in this crisis or if they are in danger of harming themselves or others, but not imminently. The result of this is we've been advised we're going to walk away. My prediction is, and I've seen enough of this, my prediction is that over time, these crises will become imminent, but there'll be possibly death and a lot of injury on the way. So that's kind of my opening remarks. I have a lot of other little bullet points that I want to hit on, but I'm going to go back to Colleen because I understand there's a lot of give and take and questions and whatnot on this thing to frame it as more of a discussion as opposed to a monologue.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Bill. So we do have some other folks with us today that if they want to chime in, we'd love to hear from their perspective. I believe I saw Rebecca Miller from the, from maybe she's not on anymore. Anyway, from Peninsula Behavioral Health. And then also I saw that Mark Nichols joined us, and also Lindsay, one of our councilmen from the city of Port Angeles. And so I would love to offer up this opportunity. Oh, and also John Nutter, who has a history of being a police officer. So yeah, if anybody wants to chime in and add some color or perspective, that would be terrific. And if not, we can let Bill espouse his viewpoints a little further.
Well, I don't know, Colleen, if you wanted me to kind of jump in and just kind of explain how all this happened during the legislative session.
Please do.
So we were, for those of you who joined late, Bill and I and Colleen were chatting earlier. And the first thing is, so these bills came out of legislators, and you know, it's a history lesson, but we have a representative form of government. So we had a number of legislators, primarily out of the I-5 corridor, who kind of saw how some of the issues were showing up in the news last year, and they decided to run on reforming police in the state. So they were front and center in their districts as to what their vision of law enforcement would be. And we have to respect the fact that those districts voted for those individuals. So when they showed up in Olympia, there was a suite of bills, pre-drafted, pre-filed, and it was they were work. You know, we worked through the legislative system. Now, because it was Zoom, I would argue, and I think Representative Theringer and Senator Vandeweghe and I have been on numerous calls this summer. I would argue that the ability to kind of work legislation and get various inputs along the way was greatly hindered this year. We lived in a two-dimensional world. And we didn't have that three-dimensional of kind of having those side conversations with legislators on the floor or at a committee meeting, or even for the citizenry to come and contact us. It was very kind of two-dimensional. But so these suite of bills were introduced. They worked through committee. There were plenty of hearings in committee, and the committees made some changes. And then it came to the House floor. And again, in a Zoom world, we had our debate. Everyone, I went through the list of bills that Colleen listed. Every one of those bills, it's been said that they all passed party line. I'm going to reframe the debate. They all passed with bipartisan non-support. Like, it was a bipartisan no vote. It was a more of a minority, but not a single Republican supported the suite of bills. There was one 5066 had a little bit of bipartisan support, but generally the opposition was bipartisan. And I think generally, if you went back and listened to TBW, which, nobody's going to do, but every bill, the debate we're close. And if we would slow down, we could get to bipartisan votes on these issues. And it is my belief that when you reform a significant portion of society, whether it be fiscally or policy-wise, that it should be a bipartisan vote. You should slow down enough that both sides, both parties who represent this state, and we were close on a lot of these bills. They were introduced in a way that was really untenable. And I think Bill and Chief Smith and Chief Myers from Hoquiam and Chief Crane from Squim, who were really engaged in this. And I mean, we were trading emails back and forth throughout the entire session. But I think that initially, especially on use of force and some of when they were first introduced, and we were able to move the bar, and we were so close to this being really a good reform package. Unfortunately, and I think I blame the Zoom world. I also blame that we had 7 pieces of legislation. Quite frankly, we probably should have just dealt with 2. And I've never seen a policy get so reformed. We don't do 7 pieces of legislation completely reforming the healthcare in one session. I mean, this was a significant reform. So there were some mistakes made. I think that there'll be some reforms coming forward. I also think, and this is just me as a legislator, and I'm not going to put words in either Mark. I see Mark Nichols is on the call, or Sheriff Benedict, but I'm willing to work with local law enforcement folks to put together a request to the state AG's office to have them look at a couple of these pieces of legislation for constitutionality. There may be I have some real deep-seated concerns that some of these pieces of legislation may not be constitutional under our state government. And I think that it would be, if we looked at it through the state AG's office, if we looked at it, that could give the legislature a pathway to gently reform these bills to make them more usable, more beneficial, especially if we don't know where the AG is. So right now you've got law enforcement that has some questions. I think you have county prosecutors who have some questions on the legality of, and especially around what Bill was talking about. What if they show up at a crime scene? And what if they let the suspect, who turns out to be the suspect, walk away and commit another crime? Where is the liability? Where normally before law enforcement would start saying, hey, we're looking for a person in a blue sweatshirt. You're a person in a blue sweatshirt. Why don't you come talk to me for a minute before you just walk away from the burning building or the crime scene? And I think law enforcement is going to have to clarify. I think we're going to have to clarify that as a society, like and so I think there's a pathway there. But again, for the record, I voted no on all of these bills, primarily because I believed that this should have been there was a way to get to it wasn't a way to get to a unanimous vote. I mean, but there were many legislators that I know personally on the other side of the aisle who were working really hard to say, can we just work with the police a little more? And bills, give the Washington Association of Police Chiefs and Sheriffs, of which I think Bill is a board member, give both Bill, the chiefs, Myers, Smith, Crane, others from my district, and then that association, they were literally begging the legislature, let us work with you, slow down. We can get there. They have always worked with the legislature. This is the first session that WASPIC, which is the acronym, really in my time in the legislature and talking with their leaders and Bill's time as sheriff, I think it was the first time where they felt a little cut out of the legislative process. So that's my critique. And that is generally why I leaned on the no side. We were not listening like on a lot of issues. And I see representatives of the hospital, for example, are here. Jennifer was here and John. When the hospital comes to the legislature and says, from a hospital perspective, this is why this bill is a problem. I, as a citizen legislator, listen to them. They're the experts. They deal with this every day. They are telling me what will and won't work. And generally, the legislature and certainly the representatives of the district will listen to OMC, will listen to our local. Does that make sense? Like, you listen, they're the experts. So when law enforcement came to us and said, we're the experts, and prosecutors came forward and said, we're the experts, work with us, we can get there. We have, their accredited policies already encompass so much. Just slow down. And I think that was the big miss. That was where the legislature, in my opinion, and that was why I ended up voting no. I voted no to support the process to get the bipartisan answers on these tough issues. I voted no to support Bill and Sherry and Chief Smith and the local men and women of law enforcement. And I also voted no to support WASPIC and the good relationship between WASPIC and the legislature. So I don't want to talk too much more, but that was my thinking. Full disclosure, I've probably been criticized more for my no votes on this issue than anything I've done in the legislature, which is ironic because I think there's some yes votes I'd actually like that back probably. But this one has lit up my email more than, because I think people thought I was supporting or I was supporting institutionalized racism in our society. And they're just, I did not do the voting no has not been uncomfortable. So I've had to explain to people why, and people will make their own choices whether they agree with me. That was that is why when you look at those 7 bills, you'll see Mike Chapman voting no. And that's my, and I think there's more work to do. I think the step to maybe ask the AG to look at the constitutionality. And then finally, we are going to have to listen to Bill, Chief Smith, the various chiefs. We have got to make sure that law enforcement continues to be the preemptive form of a civil society, because if law enforcement's authority is taken away, there's another group out there that would be more than happy to step in to quote unquote keep a civil society, and we don't want to see that unleashed in our community as well. So anyway, probably want to get to questions, Colleen.
Okay, thank you. So I know that Council Member Lindsay has a question, and then also Jim McIntyre. But Mike, have you thought about, specifically the use of force, have you thought about what the right answer is that, in between compromise, or Mark Nichols, have you, or Bill? Do you have proposed language that you think would get to the problem of excessive police force, but then also allow our officers to be able to address the situations that, I think we've all become accustomed to?
Let me throw something out real quick, and then let's get to Bill and Mark, so they're the professionals. My position on a lot of these issues around use of force specifically, a lot of agencies are accredited. And you just saw in the paper recently, the bill was reaccredited, the PAPD is accredited, I believe SQUIM is accredited. A lot of agencies are not. So before we redefine use of force, we should have looked to the accreditation standards and policies, and we should have used a carrot or a stick, meaning the agencies that aren't accredited generally are not accredited a lot of times because of the excess cost and manpower. So the state legislature could have provided revenue, money for those agencies to get accredited. And the framework of accreditation should be matching up with state law and the framework. And we didn't need to reinvent the wheel. That was one thing that I forgot to mention, but let's listen to Mark and Bill. They're the experts.
Thanks, Mike.
So let me jump in a little bit on that topic. This is my opinion, and probably the opinion of my fellow law enforcement officers on the peninsula. There wasn't anything broke with our criminal justice system, and particularly how law enforcement uses force. There wasn't anything broke that needed to be fixed here. All the problems on this were a product of the I-5 corridor, and my personal opinion on this going on there is that they have the tools, and particularly I'm talking about Seattle PD and some of their instances, they have the tools to deal with police officers who were acting unethically and even illegally. And because of unions, because of civil service commissions, because of bureaucratic impediments, the public was forced to see outrageous examples. A good example, 10 or 12 years ago, granted he was a rookie, but a police officer shot, I don't remember, it was an Indian wood carver who had a wood carving knife that had a blade that was maybe 1.5 inches long, and the wood carver was in some sort of crisis. However, was not acting out, but did not drop the knife when the Seattle police officer ordered him to, and the police officer shot him. I can't think of a more egregious example of misuse of police force that should be dealt with both on a policy basis as well as on an individual basis. But the result was he was actually exonerated because they fell behind the fact, well, that's what they teach at the academy, that someone with a knife can be a deadly threat. Well, of course that's true, but there's all that missing context. So much of this, and I could go on with many other examples where it has an outcome that you don't want. So instead of dealing with that and dealing with that specific agency, the legislature chose to put these somewhat draconian laws that are going to make no one happy in effect. And I'll go one further, is that in the 16 years that I've been sheriff, we have adopted a uniform policy. It's called Lexipol. It's written by attorneys. And honestly, right now it's about 800 pages. 800 pages of, and my law enforcement officers are expected to know that chapter and verse. Well, it's ridiculous. I don't even understand it. Sometimes we have this expectation that we can take a police officer, we can remove all discretion, and we can somehow train them so that they will react to a volatile situation that they have no control over the behavior of the folks that they're confronting and get it right every time. That really frustrates me. And I'll continue my rant by saying the direct effect of these laws, this discussion, has been right now is we can't find police officers. I have openings. PAPD has openings. Seattle has 300 openings. That's their police department used to be the largest in the state. It is now third largest. And contrary to what you might hear, it isn't because the police have been defunded in Seattle. It's because they're retiring, they're quitting, and nobody wants to be a police officer. So what the legislation did, and Mike is exactly right, is going to have to be refined. Clearly, the rest of the country is not operating under this new use of force bill or use of force restrictions to Terry stops and investigative stops. And then finally, I'll add, and this is where Mike and I and Mark Nichols might get the Attorney General involved, is that even the bill drafter is saying, oh, come on, you guys are just doing passive aggressiveness. Nowhere in there did I mean, for example, that you couldn't detain mentally ill people. Well, I go back to what I said, words matter. The law and the intent is very specific on our use of force. And here's another scary thing. This is that some companion bills, basically they put in there that if you violate that use of force, you're using your best judgment, your good faith, and let's say that you physically detain someone and you didn't have probable cause. Well, you are now personally liable. You are now liable to get decertified as a police officer in addition to the agency liabilities. I mean, I hate to say it, but the attorneys are salivating over this bill and what police are doing. So I'll stop now.
So, Lindsay, do you want to make your comment or question? Or we've got Mark Nichols has made a point prescient to this. Go ahead, Mark.
And Colleen, I'll go ahead and defer to Lindsay. I think he was using the hand raising tool, and
Yeah.
I'm just waiting, but when he's done, I'll certainly contribute briefly to
Okay.
the discussion as well. Thank you.
Yeah, and Mark's comment is about how do courts interpret the meaning of laws, and it's certainly the plain language of the statute. If the language is plain, then you don't need to go and ask, what were these 150 or so legislators thinking when they passed it. But hi, Lindsay Schroman-Warren on Port Angeles City Council. I think a few things from this conversation relevant for PAPD, and in some ways I'm paraphrasing Chief Smith yesterday morning at the Port Angeles Business Association. Port Angeles Police Department uses force in 0.5% of its encounters with people or incident response. So a lot of what we're talking about here is not the bread and butter of what a police department does, or at least Port Angeles Police Department does. I've sometimes thought of these changes as trying to do what Representative Chapman described of, let's get those non-WASPIC accredited agencies into WASPIC accreditation policies and practices. But that's not exactly what these bills did. But that seems like the direction that would have made a lot of sense for Port Angeles Police Department. Several years ago, so before anyone knew the name George Floyd, we'd reduced use of force incidents by half. And that was through different tactical decisions and also personnel decisions. So when you see for example, when you see a lot of police responding to an incident, you might drive down First or Front Street and be like, wow, that's a lot of cop cars, like something big is going down. Not necessarily. It might just be that at the very beginning of an incident response, having a lot of officers on the scene is really helpful for diminishing the risk of the incident escalating in a way that requires force. So there's things that Port Angeles Police, and I think probably the Sheriff's Office and others locally have been doing to reduce use of force. And that's been in the works now for a longer period of time than this last reform conversation. I did talk to Deputy Chief Vieta after the PAPD conversation yesterday, and he said he does have quite a bit of applicants for the open positions in Port Angeles Police Department. So having applicants is not the issue for PAPD, although there are, I think, at least 4 officers who are moving to different things for various reasons. The Association Washington City did give Chief Smith an Advocacy All-Star Award for his work in the legislative session this year. So I just want to acknowledge that and highlight that. But my question, with everyone who's on now, is trying to take a big picture understanding of how we've gotten to this situation. I've heard somebody describe police officers or sheriff's officers as, social workers of last resort. And I think in some way we've gotten there because we've cut so many of the other social work or mental health work that has often been funded by the state, whereas law enforcement is mostly funded by local governments. And I'm not trying to throw Representative Chapman under the bus because he's not the state legislature, but how much of that is an accurate view of what's happened here? I mean, with the state being responsible for mental health and local governments responsible for policing, and if the state has been cutting back on mental health, what's happened is our local law enforcement officers have to do so many different things, including a lot of things that were traditionally health work or social work. So that's kind of my question, and I'm not sure, who to direct that to, but that's kind of one of the things that I think has led to the situation we're in today.
Probably directed at me for now. You're right. I completely agree. It's been an issue that I've had a number of concerns about. It goes back, the easy answer is the Medicaid rate, of which so much of our health care and our mental health is funded. It is literally pennies on the dollar per service. So it's somewhere estimated at 64 cents on the dollar per service. So that instantly causes those agencies to provide those services to find cuts elsewhere. Secondly, good, right, or indifferent, the legislature has enacted a number of new sources of revenue, many of which I actually voted no. But with those new revenue came new programs, including, major education funding piece, now major childcare piece, issues that people don't disagree need to be funded. But at the meantime, with all of that new revenue, we still have not reformed the Medicaid rate or the public health or the mental health rate reimbursement or increased access to mental health. And I think it's a huge miss. People hate politicians who make excuses. I'll take full blame for my responsibility. I'm not on the appropriations committee and I'm not on the healthcare committee though, but our other two legislators are. So I think that's a great conversation to have with them at some point. It's something that the budget appropriators know where I I stand. And, look, I guess I could vote no on the budget and I would have if we had cut OMC's funding. The additional funding that we get for OMC, they knew my vote on the budget would have been a no vote if that had been cut. But we need more work to do around mental health. And I think that needs to be, at some point, people need to step up and say, but I will say we're going to increase. We have the Long-Term Care Act now. We have childcare, a wall of money coming for childcare. We have paid family medical leave. We have a lot of new programs that we've added in just my short time in the legislature. We've not done anything to help Medicaid and or mental health and really even healthcare. So you're right. You're right. And there's a responsibility that lays with the majority party who writes the budget and the governor. To be honest, the governor doesn't ever put in his budget either. So, I mean, there's that too.
Hey, I want to jump in too, and I want to comment on something. And this is from my perspective, a dose of reality. And Lindsay, you're correct in your assessment of needing more funding for mental health. But we could fund mental health to the nth degree. We could spend 1,000 times more on it, and it would not stop or require the interactions that police have with some folks. And I think it gets right down to the fact that in the state of Washington, and I don't think this will ever change, you can be as crazy as you want to be. And we have a lot of people that are in my jail, out of my jail, and folks that are on the street that have been offered every opportunity to for assistance with their mental health problems. And generally, it comes down to this. Mental health issues are a medical issue, if you will. It isn't people choosing to be crazy. And the solution to it is medications. And we cannot force people to take medications. I wish it were so. If it was true, I could cut the population of my jail probably by a third. The folks we're dealing with, even the social workers will tell you, if they are in crisis, sending social workers out is generally not going to stop that crisis. It's going to require some kind of manual intervention, and the social workers, if you will, for some of them, particularly some folks that have documented issues of violence, will not respond without law enforcement assistance. So I realize this is a small percentage of the mental health problems in our community, but this percentage is what contributes to the perceptions. It creates a lot of the issues along the I-5 corridor that these laws were drafted to solve.
Thank you, Bill. So Mark or Jim?
I'll jump in. Thanks, Colleen. Thanks, Bill, Mike, Lindsay, for all of your comments. For those who aren't familiar with the chat room feature on the Zoom platform, if you click on that icon at the bottom center of your screen, you'll see that I entered it's just a quote from Washington State case law, and it speaks to an important point that the sheriff spoke to in his initial remarks. That is, in Washington, our courts have stated very clearly that the starting point for interpreting a statute is the language of the statute itself. Absent a clearly expressed legislative intention to the contrary, that language must ordinarily be regarded as conclusive. And when we're talking about a clearly expressed legislative intention to the contrary, we're talking about really from the legislature as a whole, not from an individual state legislature who may be opining that the language does not adequately reflect their intent. And so, brass tacks, we have to first look at the language before we ever get to the legislature's intent. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind, because there have been different state legislatures who have been outspoken in expressing concerns regarding how the drafting has been interpreted by the law enforcement and certainly prosecution disciplines as well. A good example, one that I think is really pretty straightforward, involves the prohibition on law enforcement carrying larger than 50 caliber weapons. After the legislation passed, I think people started to learn more about the fact that your average 12 gauge shotgun usually comes in at around 70 to 72 calibers, which means that 12 gauge shotguns should no longer be carried or used by the men and women of law enforcement. They don't use them often, but believe you me, there's a time and a place when they need to have that degree of firepower to do their job. My sense is that that's an example of where the language directs one outcome. There may be some revisitation of that over the course of time, perhaps by the legislature, also in relation to some of these other issues that we're discussing. Fundamentally, from my perspective, and I cannot speak for all prosecutors, when I read the raft of legislative reforms that went into effect on Sunday, the net result of them for me is a very clear message, on the one hand, that the state of Washington is choosing to prioritize individual human life, arguably and some degree to the expense of broader notions of public safety. And so there's a sanctity of human life theme that I think has resonated through many of these reform bills. Secondarily, and it's a policy decision that I think needs to be weighed and perhaps discussed more broadly. There's so much talk about the benefits of proactive policing and community policing. Some have interpreted the legislative reforms to push the discipline more into a reactionary mode. And there will be some consequences that flow from that if the men and women of law enforcement are not able to engage at the same level and in the same way that they traditionally have. I tend to think that the remarks made by former Commissioner Chapman, now state representative, regarding trying to bring all law enforcement agencies up into accredited status would have been a great preliminary move to have shot for. And I think that may have resolved or addressed on some level many of the concerns that drove the reforms. But that hasn't happened thus far. The other thing I'll note that I think is important from a big picture perspective is that Washington State was actually ahead of the curve in relation to this. Folks may recall the chatter and discussion surrounding Initiative 940 some years ago. That advanced. There were some changes made to the law. From my perspective, they were never really given an opportunity to stretch their legs and for us to give them a try before the terrible death of George Floyd, which triggered, I believe, a large outcry that drove additional reforms. And so we've gone so far in such a short period of time. My personal belief is that some of the language of the reforms has gone too far. It will serve to micromanage the discipline of law enforcement in a way that's probably going to work some hardship on the public safety effort. And so I'm hoping that there's going to be an opportunity for the legislature to reconvene sooner versus later and make some surgical tweaks. But pending that occurring, there's going to be, I think, some continued confusion. Not only is there disagreement within the world of law enforcement regarding how best to proceed in light of the reforms, there is also disagreement within the prosecution discipline. And if you were to survey the 39 elected county prosecutors, you're probably going to get at least 4 or 5 different positions being advanced regarding what the true requirement is of the law as to the law enforcement and policing discipline in light of the latest reforms. So that probably doesn't help provide any clear direction moving forward. What it does is confirm that there's a fair amount of disagreement still. I think when people focus on, an individual or a small group of legislature statements that they didn't intend for a particular outcome, that's a red herring, because again, we need to focus on the language of the statute. We know that for a fact. And so hopefully there'll be some corrections made in time.
Great, thank you. Jim Stauffer.
Yes, thank you. I'm speaking today on behalf of WASDA's Legislative Committee, which I represent Director Area 4, which is Tuolumne, Jefferson, Kitsap, Mason counties. And I appreciate the words from Representative Chapman and Mark and the sheriff and Lindsay there. When all these, the policing issues were a concern for schools too. And a point that I made when I was deliberating with my colleagues, and we have 22 that sit on the legislative committee, was that our law enforcement here in Tuolumne County have that accreditation, which Mike and the sheriff talked about. And what is our relationship building that we have with our law enforcement is probably different than what happens on some of the I-5 corridor schools. And we have a couple of what we call school student safety positions, which then that we use those to advocate on the Hill when the session is open. I'll send those out separately here. Colleen, you could share them. But a lot of our position was maintaining that relationship, ensuring the training was done. And, we have what are called school resource officers, which could be a contract between the local PD and SQUIM, because our district is both in the county and city limits proper. Currently, we have a SQUIM PD as our school resource officer, but it's also training for if we just had what's called a security officer, and if school districts choose to contract with a private security firm. And it comes down to ensuring that the de-escalation training is involved. But I really appreciate the words about accreditation and then intent of the language in the bill, really focusing on that. And so thank you, gentlemen, and everybody for being here and hearing this great discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. So also I know Jim McIntyre had a question, and then I've got a question as well having to do with traffic stops. So Jim?
Yeah, thanks, Colleen. Just looking ahead to the future, at the earliest opportunity to make some adjustments to the bills that we're talking about, and probably Mike Chapman, you would know this better than anybody. I've heard some talk about a special session to deal with the transportation funding package that we all probably know about that didn't get out of the legislature this last session. Is there a possibility of A, if that special session happens, B, is it possible to add some tweaks to this legislation right now that deal with the problems that we know of already before it really takes effect?
Sure, and number one, you'll be glad to hear, Jim. We did change our policy where now the legislature more clearly can call ourselves into special session. We don't have to wait for the governor's to call us in. Any special session would be usually is a single subject. So probably if it is around transportation, which I'm somewhat skeptical. And the reason I'm somewhat skeptical is normally leadership will start throwing out some dates because, you got 98 legislators running the House running around this, they need to start holding dates open, and not a single date in September or October have been asked to be held open. November, December, we're not going to be in special session. So it looks like if I don't hear something in the next week or two to start holding dates open, that's probably not going to happen. But I will say, there was another point I was going to make and I forgot, so they'll probably come back. But anyway, yes and no. I don't think it'll happen. I don't think we're going to have one, but we could. I know. So you guys, Clallam County is very engaged on this issue. Our local law enforcement in the 24th have been very engaged on this issue. I think I tried to work with them. Here's what's not happening, because I just had an opportunity on Monday to meet with some legislators from King County. So their police chiefs and sheriffs are not calling them. They're not having these meetings. So the majority of legislators who pass these bills, you're hearing from police chiefs. Yeah, there was a federal way police chief did step up, and that's where one of the prime sponsors lives. But generally, your Mercer Island police chief is strangely silent. Your Redmond police chief is strangely silent. Your Bellevue police chief that I've seen are strangely silent. Your Everett police chief is. So I don't know if that's going to change, but until that changes, and until the community and the citizens in those communities have these kinds of meetings with their legislators, I don't know that much can change, because I think it was such a partisan vote. It was a hardened vote. It's going to be difficult to move the needle. I believe it should move, but I don't know. I don't know that other legislators are getting any pushback in their districts yet. Now that can change. There's a lot of ways where that can change, but we'll see.
So thanks, Mike. So on a topic that's not as critical as public safety, but I guess it could potentially be if there was a traffic accident or something. I was talking to a state trooper who shared with me his concern about this new law and said that now we can only chase down. So if they pull you over for a traffic stop, let's say you're speeding, and you don't pull over, then they're not allowed to now. The police officer can't chase the offender. So from this state trooper's perspective, and what he was hearing was that, okay, well, that means we'll only be giving tickets to the law-abiding citizens. So we're just going to stop giving tickets. Can you comment on that perspective?
Yes, I would. I'm not sure that that's completely accurate, although when you look at incentivized behavior, it's likely that could occur. The real issue behind this is that, as you know, that which you overlook, you can expect to get more of. And unfortunately, and by the way, troopers, police officers, and deputies are trained very carefully to weigh all their options, all the risk involved supervisors before a pursuit is before we engage in a pursuit. And by and large, if it was a typical speeder that even now that the state patrol pulled over or we pulled over, and if they fled, all other things being equal, if they're driving very dangerously, we would probably back off and try to assess, what is going on before we went any further. Now, in our county, I don't see this as being that big of a deal because it doesn't happen that much. It might happen a little bit more. Where you can expect that it is going to become problematical, and therefore, as Mike Chapman was just talking about, maybe it'll come to an issue, is more in the urban areas where you have gang involvement, you have gang shootings, gang criminal activity. When they flee very dangerously, and if that becomes the norm, you will see a lot of innocent people harmed because of collisions, people being run over, and just the plain dangerous driving. My solution to this, by the way, and for a second, let's stipulate that you're exactly correct. The legislature is very contrary to this, but I would use technology. If it's up to me, I would put license plate readers everywhere in the county or on Highway 101. And if someone chooses to drive so dangerously and endanger the public, and we're not allowed to pursue or to use techniques that would stop them, we can track them down using technology, or even for that matter, drones. One of the problems, though, and Representative Chapman is well aware of this, is that the party in power with the legislature is absolutely unwilling to give law enforcement those tools, whether it's license plate readers or drones, in order to safely track and follow people. So I can live with it, and I will agree, first of all, and having been out in the field, if someone is driving very dangerously and recklessly and you're following them, case law as well as the civil law has established that to some extent you, the chaser, own them and own their actions. So, look, worst case, if somebody is speeding and they choose not to pull over and you pursue them and they get in a head-on collision with another car and kill several people, you have to weigh that out. Was it worth it? Anyway, so I'd like to defer to Representative Chapman, because I think you hit on something very big, and that is, let's use technology as opposed to the old, the older methods, which do endanger innocent people.
Yeah, Bill's right. These tools have been looked at and shot down in committee for various reasons. There are privacy concerns. There's other concerns. I've supported. I think they're tools that would really help. Time will tell with regards to traffic stops, and again, I think Bill has the inside tracked on that. Time will tell how much. I think time will tell on whether police officers, how they interact with the public. I'm hopeful, but I'm somewhat, like I said, I'm not seeing the movement in the key districts that I would need to see, where I'd be more positive about saying, oh yeah, these will all be reformed next year. Conversely, I'm hearing more legislation coming, and who knows? There was legislation that did not pass. Ironically, 7 pieces of legislation that did, but there were two from 2 significant prime sponsors, and they were not happy that their legislation did not pass. So I know those pieces are coming back. This is one where the public's gonna look. This is one where if the public is concerned, and not just granted, Clallam County public, but if the public writ large is, the public's gonna have to drive this if they're with their concerns. And
Thank you, Mike.
Colleen,
Yes.
Colleen, and to put a final point on that, I can't emphasize too much my concern over a point that Representative Chapman brought up, and that is, it's nature abhors a vacuum. And if law enforcement is not out proactively and aggressively working to keep our community safe, something else will fill that. And whether it's vigilantism or whether it's just more chaos and anarchy, that's a big concern. And talking to most citizens that understand this in our county, that's the most prevalent reaction was, as well, if the cops aren't going to defend us, or if the cops are going to look the other way when violent crime is occurring, and they're not going to be able to pursue criminals, we'll do it ourselves. And that is very scary to me.
Thank you, Bill. So Mark, I'll give you the last word. It's 9:02, so we'll have to sign off real soon here.
Well, I think out of respect for everyone's time, the discussion will need to be continued to a later date. For today, what I'll say is we are nowhere if we have lost the ability to have a dialogue about these important issues. And one of the things I've always really appreciated about the North Olympic Peninsula is how interactive law enforcement is with the state legislature, with the prosecutor's office. I think we have a pretty good track record of speaking up, even in relation to contentious issues. And this set of legislative reforms certainly checks that box. And so I'm just really grateful to the sheriff for leading the discussion this morning, for State Representative Chapman chiming in, for Lindsay Schroman Warren. For my part, I'm hoping that some of what I provided was of benefit to the discussion, but I hope that this is occurring or will occur more around the state, because I think it's going to be necessary to inform the legislature regarding, from a boots on the ground perspective, what the concerns are, and that could in turn steer the direction of future reforms and maybe result in some corrections being made to what I think is some legislation that went a bit too far. And we'll wind up learning the true ramifications from that in time. I'm just hoping that through the court system, we're able to receive some guidance sooner versus later. And at the same time that the legislature has the opportunity to revisit and make some surgical tweaks, again, preferably sooner as compared to later, for the sake of public safety.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you, Sheriff Benedict and Representative Chapman, for joining us. And I will have this recording on our website, Choose Column First. If any of you missed the beginning of it, it will be readily available. So thanks for joining us, everyone, and have a great morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.